A very pleasant afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this special lecture on political uses of the past organized by the History of the Department of History and Department of Political Science. My name is Mita Rai and I will be one of your moderators for today's lecture. Before we proceed with the session, I first of all extend my thanks to the Almighty God for making today's event what it was. I would also like to thank our resource person for this evening, Dr. David Farrell-Banks, for being a part of this virtual meet. Now, without further ado, I give time to the head of Department of Political Science, Ms. Mong Inlang In Song, for a welcome address.
Good afternoon, everyone. The Department of History and Political Science welcomes you all to this virtual platform for the lecture on political uses of the past. To understand our present and to predict the future instances, one needs to know and understand the past, that is our past. So it's our privilege today to have Dr. David Farrell-Banks in our midst to enlighten us on the importance of the past. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. David Farrell-Banks, for sparing your time to share your knowledge with our students as well as everyone here today. We are all looking forward for the lecture, and I would also like to extend our gratitude to Sir Peter, who has made this lecture possible. So thank you once again, and I, on behalf of both the department, welcome everyone to this for this lecture. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Mong, for a warm welcome address. Now I would like Sir Mukhtar, the head of the Department of History, to enlighten the audience by introducing our guests for the evening. Sir, you may take your time.
Yes, thank you, Smita. Good afternoon, everyone. Respected Principal, Professor Esther, Honorable Speaker, Dr. David Farrell-Banks, distinguished Administrative Head, Mr. Peter Banks, dear participants, students, and my colleagues. So Dr. David Farrell-Banks is a research associate at Ulster University. His work is concerned with how the past is given relevance in the present. In 2021, he gained his doctorate from Newcastle University, Ireland. His doctoral research focused on uses of European past in heritage and political discourse, with the work crossing the fields of critical heritage studies, museum studies, critical discourse, and the digital humanities. His latest publication, Crossing Borders and Building Walls in Right-Wing Usage of the Past, is available in the Anthropological Journal of European Cultures. So this is shortly about Dr. Farrell-Banks. So we are very privileged to have you, sir, with us today. So we are very excited to hear from you about the topic that is political usage of the past. Thank you, sir. And I welcome you also once again to the Department of History, to this lecture, to the St. John College, Dimapur, Nagaland. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sir Mukhtar, for introducing our guest to the audience and for acquainting us about his profession and work experience. Now, as we move ahead of the program, I am most elated and honored to welcome Dr. David Farrell-Banks, our resource person for this evening. Sir, I will now hand you over to the audience. You may take your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for such a warm welcome. It's really nice to be able to speak to you this morning or this afternoon where you are about this work. I'm just going to share the presentation. What I want to speak to you about today is heritage, memory, and the politics of the past. And this is a short lecture that covers some research that took place at Newcastle University over the last few years. And it covers a couple of different disciplines, but at the heart of it is this sort of central topic of how different pasts become used in political discourse, so how they find political relevance in the present. And so a short introduction. What I'm going to speak to you about today, I can probably break down into two parts. So firstly, I'd like to introduce a couple of key themes and some of the theoretical basis for the work. And that's going to take us through a brief introduction to heritage studies, some introduction to cultural and collective memory, and a point about critical discourse and heritage as discourse as well. So I think these topics and this bit of background might be quite different to the way that you approach things if you're studying politics or history. This is something that is kind of between those two fields, but is approached from a different background. So I think it's useful to just cover some of the development of those fields of research, just so you can have a bit of understanding of where the work is situated. And then I'll go on to look at a case study, which is to think about the way in which Magna Carta is used in political discourse in the UK. Now, this might not be something which is particularly familiar to you. I know that the histories that are in the past that I'll be talking about are quite UK specific, but I will, when we come on to the case study, I'll give a little bit of background about what Magna Carta is, how it's become something which is quite totemic in British politics. To give you that background, I'll talk a little bit about then the link between Magna Carta and the Brexit referendum. This was the 2016 referendum at which the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. And we'll look at the way in which Magna Carta was used as a tool to argue for that vote to leave the European Union. And following that, we'll then use that case study to think about how political discourse and heritage discourse make use of the same pasts sometimes, and how those things exist in relation to each other. And what I hope that we get from this is a broad understanding of how different pasts become political. And even though the case that I'm talking about is very UK specific, I hope that the way in which I'm talking about it and the themes that we discuss spark some relevance to past that you might be more familiar with in Nagaland or in Indian politics. And I'd be very interested after the lecture to hear or take questions that might develop that idea further. So to start off, why are we talking about heritage here? When I'm talking about heritage, there is this, what we're thinking about quite often is the kind of official protection and representation of certain pasts. So this isn't just cultural heritage necessarily as something that's quite a broad term, but we're also thinking about the way in which heritage is formalized. So certain historical sites are protected. They're seen to have a particular value for future generations. There is this feeling that there is a necessity to preserve certain pasts. And that can either be things like statues, historic buildings, but it can also be intangible culture as well. So it could be things like particular cultural practices, particular song or food sharing, or methods of these kind of folk traditions, which we also protect and seek to kind of preserve and pass on to future generations. And Rodney Harrison in 2013 had talked about the fact that in recent decades, and certainly in Europe and America since the Second World War, there had been something of a heritage boom. So there had been this massive increase in the level to which we were protecting certain histories, or the kind of protection that we were giving them. And this can be seen a little bit in the expansion of the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites. So this is something that was begun in that sort of stems from the formation of UNESCO in the 1950s, and is particularly formalized in the early 1970s, where you get a declaration, the UNESCO Declaration of World Heritage, which talks about certain sites having universal value. So there is a sense that particular pasts, particular heritages aren't just relevant to people in one area, but they have to be protected as something which is important for the entirety of mankind. This is a universal thing that we do. So certain histories are preserved, certain histories are protected. And when that's taking place, in the same way that you might look at history or politics, when there is this trend in the way in which pasts are preserved and kept, then as academics, of course, there is a response to that that starts to look at why that might be the case and how this kind of protection is taking place and why it's happening in the way that it is happening. And from that, we get this discipline of critical heritage studies or critical approaches to heritage. And there's a couple of references here, and I can share the resources with you afterwards. And this approach encourages us to interrogate how heritage works, or how the past works, why it's preserved, and what the meaning of that is for society. So I think what it really does is it encourages us to ask, what for? What is the purpose of heritage? And specifically, as a starting point here, is heritage just about the past? Is it just simply a case of saying we are preserving these bits of history because they are important bits of history, and that's the end of it? We could counter that by thinking about how much it is about how we interact with the past in the present. When you choose to preserve something, you're saying, right now, I think that this is something important. I think that this is something, or we collectively think that this is something that is worth keeping. And then the next question that comes from that is, how much is it about informing our future? And in the introductions, we've already heard this really important point that our understanding of the past is as much about thinking about how we make decisions that impact our future. And some have argued recently that heritage is mainly and mostly about how we think about the future. So it's how we use the past, and we use our knowledge of the past to construct an imagined future. We think this is what we've learned, so this is what might be possible in the future. And when we do that, when we think about the past in these ways, we're engaging not only in our sort of knowledge of the written past or the preserved past, but we're also engaging in our memories. We're engaging a sort of sense of a memory of a particular past or a particular idea of the past that links into this question of heritage. So I just wanted to very briefly now also introduce this idea of collective or cultural memory. Now, this is a concept that first gets introduced by Maurice Halbwachs in the 1920s, who talked about the way in which different societies or groups of people might share a certain memory of a particular past. And that then becomes important in how they present themselves. And there's been a lot of renewed interest in this since the 1980s, particularly in times of political upheaval. So there's quite a lot of memory work that looks at how people remember the Holocaust or commemorate the Holocaust. It comes sort of 20 or 30 or 40 years later, because it's at that point that maybe your living record of these events starts to fade away, and what you're relying on is a shared understanding which is built up from people's knowledge that's passed from one generation to the next. And these kind of things frame our identity. The way in which these knowledges are passed on frames how we think about ourselves in the present. So this is thinking about how we remember individually and collectively, and how that impacts our identity. So how societies and collectives remember influences, as the argument goes, it influences the character of that society or that group. So we might think about why we take part in national commemorations and who that's for. So in the United Kingdom, for example, every November, we have a mass commemoration of people who have died in conflict. And this comes from marking the end of the First World War. So that's something that took place over 100 years ago now, something to which we don't really have any living memory, but it's something that's reinforced year on year in the way in which we act out a particular form of commemoration. So again, it's this, as with heritage, it's another method through which we preserve our understanding of the past, or we seek to pass on a particular understanding of the past to future generations. And what happens to us individually and collectively is, as that knowledge is passed on, we build up our own new understandings of what that past means. And then when we interact with these ideas, again, we aren't just recalling or making use of our knowledge that as developed from a particular written history, but we're also calling on our own memories of past commemorative events, our own memories of past occasions where we have interacted with these ideas. So these layers of memory build up how we understand the past, and they shape how we think about it in the present. So why does that matter? Astrid Earle talked about memory as being absolutely fundamental to our anthropological makeup. So almost much more than this, the ideas of cultural heritage being preserved as something for mankind. In some ways, memory is more intense than that, because it's so personal to each of us, and it's such a foundational aspect of how we understand our world as humans. Without memory, we are quite lost. So cultural memory provides essentially a scaffolding. So if you imagine that you are building a house or building any kind of structure, and as this structure goes up, you might put some scaffolding around the outside that shapes how the structure is built. It dictates where you go. And we can think about memory both individually and collectively in this same way, because as we grow up, as we develop our ideas, as we develop knowledge, we're scaffolded by the knowledge that we already have or our past experiences. So we're always calling on our memories. We're always calling on those memories to kind of direct us in how we understand our position in the world in the present. So memory and history in this way aren't in any kind of opposition to each other. They feed into, they work together. Our knowledge of the past might be built up by kind of written histories. And then as we interact with it, we're always calling on various forms of memory to develop our understanding of these pasts in the present. And it's memory that then gives us that sense of not just this being something important in the past, but also something that informs how we understand our potential futures. Now, I want to move on now to start to think about why heritage, identity, memory might be important in political discourse, why it might be important in the politics of the present. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this table in detail, but I think it's a useful tool, because it starts to get us thinking about group belonging, how we find our position in the world, how we find our position in particular groups of might be friends, it might be political groups. and so much of how we identify ourselves is based not just on ourselves as individuals. So much of it is based on how we identify as a part of a particular group. We might talk about our national identity, our regional identity. All of these things show an aspect of group belonging. And importantly, Montserrat Guiberneau has talked about how a feeling of group belonging is built up from a number of dimensions. And one of these dimensions is the historical. So she says that we have a selective use of history, which builds a collective memory. And that connects us to an extended family of ancestors, evoking a past which makes citizens of, in her case, she's talking about nations, but we could be thinking about any group here, which makes citizens of this nation either superior, or it gives you a sense of collective relevance. So in essence, what we're saying here is that when we interact with the past, when we visit a heritage site, when we draw on our memories of particular acts, particular kind of group pasts, this isn't just something which is helping us understand the past. It's also something which is giving us a sense of our position in the present as part of a particular group. And what this draws us to is the way in which nations or particular political groups have to make use of the past, because it is through saying, it's when they say, we have this long history, we have this long shared history, that they can then argue that there is a legitimacy to what they do in the present. So this idea of group belonging really kind of focuses on this powerful need to identify as part of a collective or a group. You can see it in sports, fandom, people supporting particular football teams. You can see it in friendship groups, but you can also see it in political campaigns. And it's built on this sense of a shared past. And this is an idea that's been talked about at quite a lot of length, particularly in terms of the way in which nations articulate their legitimacy as a nation. So Benedict Anderson has said that a nation is nothing more than an imagined community. So if you are to think of yourselves as residents and members of Nagaland as a region, you all belong to that place, but you will never come into contact with everybody who lives in Nagaland and identifies as Naga. But you still have that sense of a shared collective identity. And it is that sense of shared identity that Anderson is talking about as an imagined community, because you have this shared community that you can never meet, you can never bring together as an entire collective, but it still exists in our imagination. It still exerts this powerful kind of influence on our actions. And it's often built on this sense of a common past. And that's been put in other terms by Eric Hobsbawm as this idea of invented traditions. So you might look at a commemorative event, like the way in which we commemorate the World Wars in the UK, as an invented tradition, an invented action, which every time we take part in it reinforces this sense that we have a shared identity as a nation. So the past, heritage, memory, all of these things are really powerful in how they construct, or they help us construct and reinforce this sense that we belong to particular groups. We belong to this nation. We belong to this local kind of group. There's so much emotive power in the way in which the past becomes part of our lives. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the politics of the past, more specifically. And this photo is from last year, a moment when some protesters in Bristol in England tore down a statue and threw it into the river. And this was a statue of a man called Edward Colston, who was a slave trader, but was quite a prominent figure in constructing a lot of buildings and things around Bristol. And this image, I think, shows us how the past can be seen to be so powerful politically. For these protesters, this statue of a slave trader was a symbol not only of a past that involved the kind of horrible actions of slave trade and everything else, but this was also a symbol of racism and inequality in the present. So by tearing down this symbol of the past, you're making a point about the politics of the present. And one of the ways in which we can start to think about the politics of the past when we engage with heritage sites, when we engage with histories, is to think about heritage as a form of discourse. And what I'm talking about here is the way in which heritage is a form of language, is a form of propaganda, or is interacts with us as a kind of text or language. It communicates with us. And just a little bit of an introduction to this as a methodology. When we take a critical look at something as a piece of discourse, what we're recognizing is that there is a particular structures of power or persuasion that are built into that kind of act of communication. So it helps us recognize the power of the past as a political tool. And Ruth Wodak, one of the main proponents of critical discourse, has talked about how in political discourse, you can see a particular form of propaganda or a particular form of rhetoric that makes use of the past. And she talks about this as a topos of history, but I wouldn't worry too much about this as a technical term. More what she means here is that you might find a statement where a politician will make a reference to a particular action that's been taken in the past or a particular event in the past. They will make that relevant to a chosen target group. So whoever they want to talk to with their political speech, with their content, whatever, they make that past relevant. And by making it relevant, they are saying, this means that a particular action should now be taken in the present. Because we did this in the past, and because that past is relevant to us, this is what we should do now. So we can look at how the past is represented as discourse and focus on the language of the past to see how in politics, in heritage sites, in other locations, these pasts are communicated to us in a way that try and encourage us to take particular actions or to think about particular futures and to engage in a particular form of politics. So that I realized that was a very quick run through of some quite complex and diverse bits of theory, but I hope that it gives some sense of how these ideas of thinking about heritage and thinking about politics and thinking about identity and belonging, how these things can all be seen in relation to each other. And what I'd like to do now is just talk maybe for about the next 10 to 15 minutes about a particular case where we can see those ideas enacted, how we can see them in political discourse, how we can see them as something active and taking place around us. So this case study is to talk about Magna Carta and Brexit, and as I realize that these are quite United Kingdom focused examples. So I'll give you a little introduction to what we're talking about here. And the image that you can see here is an image of Magna Carta. It's a document that was first drafted in 1215, and it's essentially a legal text that has come to be something which is seen as being very, very relevant to how England and Britain developed as a country. So, an introduction to Magna Carta. It's a legal text first drafted in 1215 that was designed to take some power away from the king. Now, the background to this is essentially that you have a king of England who has been involved in a number of wars with France, not very successfully, and to try and reclaim some of the lost money and things that have been spent on those battles, the king is massively increasing taxation on some of the wealthy barons, they're called, in England, and they really don't like this. They're very angry, and there is the threat of civil war. There is the threat of a revolution. So the king, King John, writes or agrees to sign up to this document called that essentially gives more power to these barons. So it's a document of necessity. It's not something the king necessarily wanted to do, but it's something that was necessary to stop a revolution. But it was a complete failure. It lasted initially for only a few months before being scrapped. There was a civil war. There was a lot of upheaval, following which King John dies, and Magna Carta is redrafted in 1216 and again in 1225, and finally brought into British law, or English law at the time, in 1297. So it's a very complicated and complex bit of history, but it was also a document that really focused on giving some rights to a very small group of people, a very small group of wealthy people. But in the century since then, it's been framed as something of an English or British constitution. So it's seen as a document that, because it takes rights away from a king and gives them to the people, it's seen as something which is foundational to the development of democracy in England and the United Kingdom. The reality is much more complex than that, but that is the way that it's often talked about. And it was influential globally. So it influenced political acts, including the American Bill of Rights, so the development of democracy in the US. And people often talk about this as even being relevant right the way through to things like the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have something that was very specific, that related to a very kind of complex time, and only really gave any power or rights or influence to a very specific small group of people. But those facts are less important now than this sense that Magna Carta was a document that was about human rights, that was about fairness and equality. It was about the fact that no one person could have too much power. So that's kind of how it's viewed. Now, in 2016, and this is a bit of a jump, it's to something quite different, and that's Brexit. So in 2016, we have a referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union. And that takes place because of a commitment in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2015. Interestingly, some people see this as also an act of necessity. So the Conservative Party did not want to lose votes to the United Kingdom Independence Party, who were very anti-European Union. So they commit to a referendum, thinking that they will win that referendum and will stay in the European Union. But in 2016, the UK voted 52 to 48% to leave the EU. And as we go through our experience of Brexit, I think some would consider it, like Magna Carta, to be a total failure at the start. So why am I jumping from 1215 to 2016? Why am I talking about these two things in tandem? In 2015, the leader of the UK Independence Party, who was one of the main campaigners to leave the European Union, released this note at the start of their manifesto. And apologies if the text is a bit small here, but I want to read you just one section. So this was 2015, the 800th anniversary of the first drafting of the Magna Carta. And having outlined his view for the election, what the UK Independence Party would do, their commitments, this man, Nigel Farage, he then says, if you believe in these things, that is UKIP's politics, and that in this year, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, you believe we should seize the opportunity for real change in our politics, rebalance power from large corporations and big government institutions, and put it back into the hands of the people of this country, then there really is only one choice, and that is to vote UKIP. So here we can start to see how the past is used in political discourse. Nigel Farage here doesn't at any point say specifically why Magna Carta is important to the point that he's making. His goal here is to talk about voting for UKIP, but he says, if you believe in these things in this year, in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, then this is what you should do. And if you remember a minute ago, I was talking about this particular form of political discourse where you say, this thing took place in the past, it's relevant to us, so this is what we should do now. This is what's taking place here. He's saying, do you call on your memory or your understanding of what Magna Carta is? It's relevant to us as people in England, and because of that, you should vote for UKIP or you should vote to leave the European Union. We see it again in the run-up to the Brexit referendum in 2016. Magna Carta kept coming up in newspapers, in political campaigning. And this is just one example. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, a member of Parliament in the UK, and a campaigner to leave the European Union, argues that the reason that we should leave the European Union is because the laws of the European Union strip Britain of its Magna Carta rights. Now, if you remember, Magna Carta was a failure at the start. Nothing that was written in Magna Carta is in used law in the UK now. But the reference to this past becomes something very powerful for political persuasion. It's a suggestion that the European Union acts against something which is a fundamental part of our collective history. Therefore, we should leave the European Union. Interestingly, you can see how when you follow these uses of particular pasts, you can sometimes start to see how they gain traction beyond their initial use. So around the time of Brexit, this particular past was being used to argue for leaving the European Union. But if you follow how it emerges in political discourse on social media, it also became a moment that was being used by the extreme far right in the United Kingdom. Magna Carta was now something so fundamental to what it meant to be British, to be English, that for British or English nationalists, it was a very useful thing to talk about. Sorry, just Now, I don't want to go into too much detail on what these quotes are. They're essentially two tweets that that were posted in 2017, at a time when the far right, so essentially an extreme nationalist, racist, xenophobe, a man called Tommy Robinson, was imprisoned. And for his supporters, this imprisonment was seen as something that went against Magna Carta rights, or it was somehow something that was such an assault on our shared history that it had to be opposed. And Magna Carta was a symbol of this shared history. So this document that has no real relevance in the present, other than as an idea, becomes a powerful reference point in political discourse. Now, one of the reasons that I'm sharing some tweets here, more than the specific context, is I think it helps us understand why the past is so important in political discourse. And it comes down to this sense that a particular past has a certain meaning attached to it. So when people mention or talk about Magna Carta in this case, they're not only talking about a particular past, they're actually talking about the ideas associated with it, ideas of equality, of freedom, of rights against an all-powerful elite. And they can communicate all of those ideas in two words, just by mentioning Magna Carta. So that is part of the way in which the past is so powerful in political discourse, is because it is a method through which a huge sense of a shared past, but also quite complicated ideas, can be communicated in a tiny number of words. And if we think about the way in which so much of politics is played out on Twitter, on Facebook, on these kind of digital means, we can see why being able to distill ideas down into a couple of words becomes very important. Now, to take us right the way back to the start and think about heritage again, I want us to then, just to finish off, I want to think about what that means to anybody who might be involved in the protection or representation of different heritages, of different pasts. If we know that a particular past is being used in a divisive way in politics, if it's being used to champion extremist, xenophobic, racist politics, how do we then think about the way in which we talk about those same pasts as a bit of national heritage? So this image is from the Magna Carta Memorial in England. And the statue says that it is to commemorate Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under law. Now, this idea, the idea that's being communicated here, is the same idea that is being communicated in political discourse when Magna Carta is talked about. It is the idea that Magna Carta is not just a document that was written 800 years ago. It is a symbol of something, and it's a symbol of freedom. It's a symbol of freedom and rights. So we see the same central theme emerge in the way in which Magna Carta is represented as a piece of heritage, as we do when we see Magna Carta used in political discourse. The same thing was found when if you visit a number of museums that have displays relating to Magna Carta. This is just one image from my research that was taken from a particular cathedral museum, where there was a collection of objects, of artifacts taken from recent protest movements, including the protests against Mubarak in Egypt from 2011 to 2015, part of the so-called Arab Spring protests. The way in which this was being presented in the museum was to say that Magna Carta was somehow something that is still relevant to how we understand different protest movements or fights for freedom in the present. So again, it distills the meaning of Magna Carta down into something which just symbolizes an idea of equality against tyranny, I suppose. Now, why I think that this is important is that it draws attention to the way in which the political use of the past, even when it's a political use of the past that we might disagree with, is often built on the same ideas that we might find in the way in which those same pasts are represented as a piece of heritage. So if there is a simple central theme to how we communicate the importance of a particular past, that past then becomes something which is very potently used in political discourse. So if when we communicate as heritage practitioners, as historians, as academics, if we communicate an idea of the relevance of a piece of history like Magna Carta as something that can be distilled down to a history which is about freedom, equality, or justice, then it shouldn't really surprise us when those same pasts are used to communicate the same idea, but for a completely different purpose. So it's used to communicate how we should have freedom from the European Union, but on false terms. It's used to try and communicate an idea that there should be freedom for an extremist, a racist politician. So we might disagree vehemently with how those pasts are being used, but the themes that are present in that political discourse are the same themes that we find often in heritage discourse. So yes, that's the summary here. So you get these common themes of fairness, justice, and equality, and it becomes linked in political discourse not only to these particular actions, but it also becomes linked to some sense of English or British exceptionalism. So it's not just saying this is something that took place in the past, so we should do this in the present. It's saying this is something that we did in the past, that our ancestors did, and therefore we have a superior right to do something in the present. And this is another way in which heritage and the past can become so powerful in political discourse, because it doesn't just communicate the need for a particular action, it communicates also that sense of group belonging and superiority, which can be so persuasive to people. And it's important, I think, to recognize this, because these themes that are used in political discourse are often echoed in the way in which we see these things take place, emerge in heritage. It's something, I think, that demonstrates why it's important to look at heritage site representations of the past, or representations of the past in historical texts, or in the way in which we learn about the past, in relation to how those same things might be used politically in the present. Now, I've talked about these things very specifically in relation to an example from the United Kingdom. But I would be very curious in the questions and in some discussion to hear about if this is something that you can see take place in Nagaland or in Indian politics more broadly. So as a brief conclusion, I hope that what I've talked about today helps us understand that the way in which we interact with the past is so much about how we imagine our futures and how we try and develop those futures through political action. There is a power in the manner in which these pasts are used to evoke a sense of collective belonging. We belong to this nation, we belong to this group. And that makes the past so intensely powerful as a form of political discourse. But importantly, the way in which that political discourse works is not disconnected from their heritage representations. So perhaps when we see somebody using a particular understanding of the past as a means to argue for something divisive or something racist, we might think about how we can communicate those pasts as a bit of heritage in a more effective way, which makes sure that they can't be used in such a divisive manner. I think it's something quite challenging for academics, for historians, for heritage practitioners, and for those of us who like to interact with the past and engage with the past and history in our daily lives. So there is a set of references here. If it would be of interest for me to share some of these resources, then I can send this set of references and some other resources over to Peter after the session to pass on to you. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you for listening. And I hope that despite this being something quite focused on the United Kingdom, I hope that you found it interesting and useful, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us with the importance of one's past and heritage and why it matters. And I believe my fellow mates have learned a thing or two from the presentation you made. Now that we have listened to our resource person's lecture, some of us might have queries and doubts which we would like to have an answer to. So I give time to my fellow moderator, Kirina S. Jimo, to lead the Q&A round for this evening.
It's in question R. So if anyone has any question, you can either on your microphone or write it down on your comment box. Even the teachers can participate on it. One question. Why does heritage matter so much in the contemporary world?
Thank you. That's a question that probably has quite a number of different answers that are all relevant. One argument is that as we exist in a very kind of globalized society, and at a time where you have rapid technological change and instability, there is an argument that the preservation of heritage becomes something that gives us a sense of stability. So particularly at times of social or political upheaval or uncertainty, if you can look on a deep history, you know, a bit of heritage that goes back hundreds or thousands of years, it gives this sense of the kind of stability of human existence and endeavor, which is quite powerful. So I think that's one side of it. And I think that is very, very relevant in terms of thinking about why people are so drawn to heritage sites or to museums, or just drawn to things that help us understand our shared past. I think a second answer is that is on the political side of things. It's that sense of a deep history and stability, and that that is another reason why heritage matters so much, because it can be very useful as a way of let's think about how the best way to put this. It's something that's very useful to not only connect with people on an individual basis, but it's very useful in terms of saying our nation has a long history, or our region has a long history, that can make you feel more confident about your place in the world and in the present, in the contemporary world. So it helps us individually place ourselves in the contemporary world, and on a political basis, it can help political parties or campaigners place people collectively in the contemporary world. So it's all about giving us that security of identity, position, and purpose. And it does, I think that helps give people confidence when they're approaching uncertain futures. So I hope that answers your question. And I think if you ask somebody from a heritage site or a different academic, they will give you a series of different answers, because there are so many complex answers to that question.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. Is there anyone who wants to ask more questions?
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yes, actually, yeah, my query is about in regards to the Indian heritage, in present politics of India, many heritage from the medieval age, which sometimes the rulers or the political leaders, they are actually sometimes saying that these are not the culture of Indian culture. For example, one in a statement given by the Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister, and he was telling that he is going to remove the Taj Mahal from the list of heritage site of the state. So in regards to that, because since these are also the identity of India, Indian culture, Indian heritage. So as a student or as a teacher of history, how can we see those things, or how can you see compared to the European heritage, or government the measures which has been taken by the government of Europe or government of England to protect those heritage, or how can you see how we react, or how should, what should be the measures has been taken by the teachers or students of history to protect those sites, since those sites or heritage places, since because as a student of history or as a member of the country, we need to protect those heritage monuments or sites. So in these things, how can you see, or what will be the this opinion of yours?
So there's a couple of, thank you for the question. And I think there's a couple of very interesting points there. Firstly, there's as much as I think we've spoken a lot today about how particular bits of heritage are chosen to be preserved or kept. Of course, there's always equal decisions made about particular pasts or heritages that aren't preserved or aren't kept, because and that happens here as much as anywhere else in the world, where certain pasts that aren't seen as being so relevant to national identity or so important to those in power at the time might not be protected, they might be damaged, they might be lost. So those decisions are always being made. I think as historians or heritage practitioners or academics, our role there is to try and use our voice and our knowledge to communicate and sort of publicly communicate why a diversity of heritages are important to be preserved. And I think that kind of diversity is really important in pushing back against some of the political trends at the moment, because it's about trying to make that case that even if a particular group is not dominant at a given time, their heritages and their past are still part of our shared heritage and past, and should be preserved in those terms. And I find, I hadn't come across this example of the Taj Mahal trying to be removed as from the state heritage site list, but it is that, on those occasions, I think it is about trying to engage in sort of public communication of why different pasts are important, and different cultures are important to be preserved. But it's not always as straightforward as that. And even last week we had, very close to where I live in Newcastle, a piece of industrial heritage from the sort of early 1900s in the northeast of England was knocked down, was destroyed. It was something that was very iconic in the region, but wasn't seen as important on a national level. So the government made a decision that it could be knocked down. And these things are happening all the time. And it's quite difficult to know how to push back against that trend. I think it's a constant challenge. I hope that answers at least part of your question.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Sir, there is another question for you from Smita Rai. Can we completely blame the historical past of Afghanistan for breeding terrorism in contemporary world politics?
I wouldn't seek to claim to be able to answer that question with any real authority without having I'm not an expert when it comes to Afghan politics and history. What I would say is that the way in which the past has been used in relation to Afghanistan can draw our attention to a number of different trends in how we think about our understanding of the past. I don't think we should ever be at a point of blaming the past, as it were. The past is always used in different ways by different groups, some very positive, some very negative. If we're thinking about how certain pasts are removed or certain heritages are removed from are not protected, we could think about how in the 1990s the Taliban at the time in Afghanistan did blow up a heritage site called the Bamiyan Buddhas, so statues of Buddhas in the hillside that were destroyed as not part of Afghan culture. But I think that's separate to any kind of problems of terrorism in the present, which are so complex and as much the result of sort of Western intervention in these regions over decades and decades and decades that have brought around instability. Interestingly, at the time, quite often when Afghanistan comes back into global view, you see images shared from the 1950s and 1960s of people in Kabul, and images of Kabul as a very kind of a liberal modern city, coffee shops, people out and about in all sort of different forms of dress. And in some ways, these images are shared also as a political use of the past, because they're shared as if to say, well, this is what, Afghanistan was doing okay before decades and decades of United States intervention. But there's so much complexity to a situation like that, that goes far beyond heritage and the past and my own knowledge of the region.
There's also another question from Ms. La, Head Department of Political Science. Do you support that? Can you explain in few words how Brexit would benefit Britain, Britain in general?
I was very much against Brexit, and I should make that clear that I suppose that the examples of political discourse that I showed today that were quite successful in persuading people to vote for Brexit were very much not things that I support myself. I think for those people who, on a political basis, the people who pushed for Brexit, they would see the benefits for Britain in terms of things like more sort of freedom to do things like privatize the health service and bring in other changes that haven't been possible when we've been so closely tied to the EU. I think it's so much of it was about increasing the wealth of a very small number of people. I find it very difficult at the moment to see what tangible benefits could be seen from Brexit over the next few years. It's been very difficult for people who were European Union citizens who are still living here and working here, who are now more marginalized. For businesses, in a lot of places, it's become significantly more difficult to trade with those countries closest to us. So yes, I find it very tricky to see what benefits there might be, at least at the moment. Although who knows what down the line, but at the moment it's just causing chaos.
Thank you, sir. If anyone wants to ask more questions, you can write it down on the chat box or on your microphone and ask the question. I guess there is no one who wants to ask more questions, sir. Thank you for your answers. It was such a blessing. Now I hand over the time to Smita to take over the program.
Thank you, Kirina, for hosting the Q&A round, and I believe the audience is now more clarified with their doubts and inquiries. As we move ahead to the end of the program, I now give time to our administrative head, Sir Peter Banks, to virtually conclude the meeting with a vote of thanks.